My name's Benjamin Lee. I'm the Senior Vice President for International Affairs and Professor of Anthropology and Philosophy at the New School for Social Research. I'm going to give a very, very brief introduction. Charles will speak for about 50 minutes, and then what we're trying to do is create as much time for questions from the other panelists and from the floor as possible, because we do have to leave very promptly at around 7:25. I think Charles is one of those people who needs no introduction, but for those of you who don't know his background, he got a BA in history from McGill University in 1952, was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford in philosophy, politics, and economics, and then did a DPhil under Isaiah Berlin and Elizabeth Anscombe, a very interesting combination for those of you, which might explain Chuck's presence.
I'm mixed up.
He was also the Chichla Professor of Social and Political Theory at Oxford, a Fellow of All Souls College. He's also a Professor of Political Science and Philosophy at McGill University, and the Board of Trustees Professor of Law and Philosophy at Northwestern University. In 1995, he was made a Companion of the Order of Canada. In 2000, a Grand Officer of the Order of Quebec. And for this, 2 years ago, he was with Gerard Bouchard on a National Commission of Inquiry into reasonable accommodation in Quebec, dealing with multicultural issues in Quebec. In 2007, he was awarded the Templeton Prize, which is given to a living person for discoveries and breakthroughs to expand, this is a quote from the Templeton, human perceptions of divinity and to help in the acceleration of divine creativity, quite a burden for a prize. The best thing about the prize is the monetary award is adjusted to always be slightly larger than the Nobel Prize. So, in 2008, he also was awarded the Kyoto Prize by the Inamori Foundation in Arts and Philosophy. His books, I'll just list a few. In 1964, for those of us who remember, I was just a undergraduate beginning to read the Explanation of Behavior, the critique of B.F. Skinner. In 1975, his Hegel book appeared. In 1989, Sources of the Self, The Making of Modern Identity. In 1994, Multiculturalism, Examining the Politics of Recognition. In 2004, Modern Social Imaginaries. And 2007, A Secular Age. He's also very famous in Canada for having launched the career of Pierre Trudeau by running against him and losing for the Parliament in 1965.
After this introduction, I at last understand myself. This is great. Maybe it'll unsettle me. But I'm very pleased to be here because the discussions that I've had in the New School over the years have been very important to me, and it's a wonderful thing to come back. If I talk at this distance from the mic, is that going to be okay? Can people hear? Yes. So, no. There's differing views about this. Yeah. But I don't know quite what to do about it. It seems to be stuck at this level, at this distance. So I'm very glad to be here, particularly to talk about this issue, which has become so central. And when I say polysemy, I'm going to talk about several kinds of polysemy. The word isn't as simple, secular isn't as simple as one thinks. I want to first of all talk about an historical development of how the word came to be used the way it is now and what shifts occurred in bringing that about. And then I want to give a revisionist polysemy. I'd like to present another definition of what is central to secularist regimes. And when I get to this part, I'm going to be talking quite a bit from the basis of the report of the commission for the Quebec Commission on Reasonable Accommodation that Ben just referred to, and particularly our Chapter 7 on the issue of un régime laïque. And this is something that I see that Jocelyn McClure is here, who is one of the central collaborators on the commission that helped to design this position that I'm going to try to present with certain frills and modifications, but the basic position is the one that we adopted in the report. But let's look at the historical side first, because, see, really what we have in the West is this word we use, originally was part of what I want to call an internal dyad. Secular was a word referring to, if you like, time, ordinary time. The word seculum means century or age. And it contrasted to another kind of time, eternity, something beyond our ordinary time. But when I say it was an internal dyad, what I mean by that is that these are two terms, not just which are defined in opposition to each other, because there are lots of terms like that. Internal dyad, in what my use here means, that they couldn't be instantiated separately. They couldn't have one of them without the other. Things like up and down, right and left are examples of internal dyads. You can't have things on the right without things being on the left. You can't have things that are up without things that are down, and vice versa. And what happened, the whole evolution, is that this internal dyad became, if you like, an external dyad. That is, it became conceivable to have the ambition of having a purely secular society or purely secular regime, or etc. In other words, it became an external dyad not in the sense that each term wasn't defined in relation to the other, secular, sacred, secular, higher time, etc., but in the sense that it was possible to conceive of one without the other. So it was, the medieval world was a world in which this was really seen as something that couldn't be, things that couldn't be separated. The big change in outlook that made possible that move from an internal to an external dyad, and I think this is one of the most important things to ponder about the development of Western civilization, was the idea of what I tried to call in the book the imminent frame. That is the idea of a self-sufficient imminent realm, self-sufficient imminent realm that you can see in the domain of post-Galilean natural science. In other words, by that I mean it's a realm, imminent realm, whose operation can be explained in terms that arise and apply in the imminent frame, in the imminent realm itself. I mean, just to give you a contrast, think of Plato. I mean, the Platonic notion that the movement and operation and development of things around us can only be understood with reference to the ideas, transcendent ideas, in this case another time concept, the ideas are eternally unchanging, which the things down here around us which are changing are in some way imitating or striving to imitate or approximate and so on. So you don't get the possibility of a self-contained explanation of what's happening in time and space around us in the terms that simply apply to time and space around us, but you have something beyond. I'd like to claim that in most civilizations in history up till the modern West, this kind of cleavage couldn't be, kind of neat cut couldn't be made. Now it's the making of that and all the complexity of that that gives us the possibility of seeing secular versus sacred, secular versus higher time and so on, as a, what I call an external dyad, where it's perfectly conceivable to say, well, okay, all there is this internal, is this imminent realm. That means that the word secular acquires this potentially polemical force. That is something that you want to expand at the expense of the thing that is defined in relation to, even maybe to the point of doing away altogether with that other term. And that's why we can see that secularism, this term, acquired, quite understandably in this long, complex history, it acquired, among others, a polemical sense of being against religion or trying to set a clear boundary to religion, or maybe push back that boundary, or maybe get rid of it in extreme forms, get rid of it altogether. So that's part of what gets into the, if you like, conceptual DNA of this term. And that's part of the legacy. The other part of the legacy, of course, is that people sometimes think in terms of both phases of this history. Sometimes it's used as a term which obviously has an opposite which also applies. I mean, a realm of religion and so on. And sometimes it's used as a term which could describe a self-sufficient world on its own without religion. So both phases of Western history are reflected in the sometimes very confusing use of the term today. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, this leaves us with the word secular having very often this almost unavoidable reference and very often negative reference to religion. And what I'd like to do is now do some revision, and this revision may sound very shocking, but I'd like to propose a way of understanding the logic of what we call secularist regimes. Incidentally, we're talking in English, so we're saying secular, but of course a lot of our discussion was with the word laïque, laïcité. I mean, this is this word which you see used in France and in the corresponding word in Italian and Spanish and even Turkish, laïque, they've taken over. This word has exactly the same kind of history because originally the lay people were opposed to clergy, and it didn't make sense to speak of people as lay people except that they were in a world, in a universe, in a church, in a society where there were clergy. So it's exactly the same kind of internal dyad between lay and clerical as you see between secular and sacred or secular and higher time and so on. So although the logic of laïcité is in certain ways different from the logic of secular in English, nevertheless, we have the same kind of analogous kind of history. An internal dyad becomes an external dyad. Well, so we have this almost obligatory reference to religion. I want to make a case that there's something very inadequate about that, or that we could do better. We could have a much better account of what secularist regimes amount to and what underlies them. Not only better, I think, in the end, in order to understand how all this works, but more specifically also better for us today. And what I want to say is that the real point of a secular regime, secularist regime, is a way of managing diversity of basic, religious, anti-religious, metaphysical, moral, basic positions. I want to talk about that and what I mean by that in a minute, of very different basic positions that are held in a society, way of dealing with that diversity in a way which ensures I'd like to say three basic goals. In the report we talked about two, but I want to add a third. And let me lay them out very quickly. Number one point, in a way to deal with this diversity in a way which assures the maximum freedom. You might start off by saying freedom of religious expression. I want to modify that in a minute, but just to get these three out in their basic form. So, assuring the maximum freedom of religious expression. Secondly, assuring a real equality of respect between the different religious and non-religious and a-religious positions. And I want to add to that a third one, which could be thought to be a corollary or a kind of entailment of number two, but I want to bring it out as something separate. Trying to ensure these first two principles obviously requires a great deal of discussion. We aren't going to agree exactly on the way to ensure the maximum freedom of religion. We aren't going to agree on the way of ensuring really even-handed treatment of different religious and other views. It's going to be something up for discussion, up for negotiation, up for working out by the democratic process. So point number three takes account of that and says the third goal is to ensure to the maximum degree that all the different religious positions, a-religious positions and so on, have some input into this debate, this discussion, right? This is not a situation in which, sometimes we find this in contemporary society, in which one of the religious or metaphysical, or what you call them, families, are more or less marginalized and their views are not taken into account. So these are three basic principles. Now, if you start thinking a secularist regime is this, start thinking from this point of view, it doesn't need to be mainly concerned, if you like, with religion. First of all, the second principle, which might be thought of in other terms as a principle of neutrality, that the state, the structures, public structures are not on the side of or against any particular view. That's not only true in their relation to the religions in the society, that is, it's not simply that they're neutral between religious positions, they've also got to be neutral between religious and irreligious positions, even-handedly over that particular gap. And you can see the difference here when you look at I want to have in mind the American and French cases. I was having a discussion with Tariq Moudud on the train down here, and he was saying, why is it that everybody takes these two as the two great paradigms? They don't really deserve that much attention. And I really think he's right about that. But I have to talk about them because they've got a lot of attention. I mean, people think of them as great paradigms that you have to focus on. And so let's look at them. The American paradigm is very interesting because it was started off with, people call it separation of church and state. I mean, actually, the First Amendment talks about not establishing a religion and ensuring the free exercise of religion. But as you know, in the early part of the years of the Republic, for many people, that was a neutrality between different, really, I would say, let's push it farther, different Protestant Christian churches. I mean, I was going to say different Christian churches, but it was the beginning of Catholics were looked at rather askance. So it was different Protestant churches, and you find actually interesting things which may surprise people today, like famous Judge Story in the 1820s of the Supreme Court, who said, well, I mean, of course, there can't be any identification of the Republic with any church, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a strong identification with religion, and this is a Christian country. And then later on in the century, there was actually a move by some people to put an amendment in the American Constitution making clear that this was a Christian country. And it's that phase of there was then resistance to that on the part of Catholics, Jews, people who called themselves secularists. See, the word began to be used in that context to fight back against that, and that fight won out, and therefore you have the present situation that you have in the United States. But it didn't just happen automatically through the separation of church and state, right? Because this had to be defined in quite other terms, in terms of a real all-around, all-direction, if you like, neutrality or even-handedness between all these different positions. And that point was won through a battle in which the word secular arose in a rather polemical context, right? Fighting against that idea that America is a Christian country and should declare itself to be so. And then if we look at the French case, much more obviously, we all know that history, that you have a would-be hegemonic church and the fighting back against that, and the battle between the Republicans and the Catholic right and so on. So clearly, the whole point of the operation of laïcité was to put a bulwark, a boundary against this hegemonic move and so on. So here you have two cases in which the word secular bubbles up. I mean, secular or laïque. I'm sorry, I'm using these words for the moment interchangeably, and they aren't really, but take them as analogous words. You get these words bubbling up in a context of polemic against potential religious domination, right? So it's quite clear that in that case, the application of principles like freedom of expression and so on should be conceived in a contest with religion. But the point I'm trying to make is that there's no intrinsic connection here. It makes sense in those contexts. But there are other contexts in which it doesn't make this kind of sense at all. And of course, I have also to name another debt I have, the work of Rajiv Bhargava in his commentary on Indian secularism, makes that very clear. There, the starting point is not a hegemonic religion or hegemonic church trying to take over. No, it's the existence of this pervasive and important religious, metaphysical, and other diversity and difference. And the whole point of the secular regime was to precisely ensure freedom and even-handedness. That was, you could see that from the very beginning of that, that operation. So in a way, the Indian case is, to me, an example of where this other kind of definition I'm proposing makes sense, but it's also, in a certain sense, a reflection of the generic situation, that is, situation that isn't marked by a particular issue of a hegemonic religion. Right? So there we have, in a certain sense, a displacement of the center of attention on religion when talking about secularism, displacing it onto the issue of how diverse views, basic beliefs coexist. And that means that my original formulation of the first principle, which was freedom of religious expression, has now to be altered. And we should really speak, and this also is in our report, we should really speak of freedom of conscience. And many people are coming to this point. That is, the generic goal is freedom of conscience for people of any basic belief. That, you know, for instance, if you, as an example we use, I mean, if you think of a situation in jail where there is you're not voluntarily there, you're involuntarily there, and there's a menu, and the menu includes meat, and you are a vegetarian, you can stand up and make a demand that an alternative menu be provided. Now, what's all that about? Well, it's not about religion, because there might be two people making these demands. One might be a very pious Hindu, and the other might be someone who's read, you know, an atheist utilitarian who's read Peter Singer and become deeply impressed with that and is also a vegetarian. There's absolutely no reason to treat these two cases as any different, one from another. But why are these two cases important? Well, I think I'm trying to spell out, we try to spell out some of the intuitions here, and maybe questions about this, so let's talk about it afterwards. It's something of the following kind. There are some very deep, basic beliefs which are closely connected to a person's moral integrity. That is, to force them not to act on or not to declare or not to follow through on those beliefs, unless you have very, very good reasons, but to force them not to do that is kind of damage to their moral integrity. They have to do some violence to themselves in order to do that. And this is the case of a vegetarian, or in another context where, you know, where you were talking about conscientious objection of a pacifist, who may be so for philosophical reasons, maybe so for religious reasons. But what these two cases have in common is that they spring from those very deep convictions which are connected to the moral integrity of the person. Now we get to the root of why my principle one is important. That is so it's the liberty of expression, of living out, of being able to state and so on, one's, let's call them deep convictions here for the sake of this argument, whether they be classified as religious or non-religious. And once you get to this point, you see that lots of them are very hard to classify. I mean, in our present day, there are lots of positions that are just not, well, maybe they are religious, maybe they aren't, or people who say, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. I mean, you know, but we don't need to classify these anymore. So that is the position, and it involves, as it were, decentering attention from religion. Now, why is this hard point to get people to agree to? Because I found it quite hard. We had a lot of trouble in our discussions in Quebec on this. People had very clear ideas of what laïcité was, and it didn't start off being that. And it's partly to do with the history in certain societies. And the history, you know, if you're speaking out of the French context, you can understand that this is the way you look at it. Incidentally, I want to say about French laïcité en passant that it's not as much taken over by that archaic conception that it's a battle against religion, as people think. Very interesting things happen. If you look at the detail, people like Jean Bobéro have written about this, the actual detail of the 1904-1905 legislation. In some of the first drafts of it, it was very, very much more directed against religion. And then people like Jaurès, I say Briand, but Jaurès, a particularly important case, sort of rectified it by saying, look, the really important thing here is freedom of conscience, right? So let's not write the legislation as a legislation which is anti-religious. Let's write it as a legislation which ensures freedom of conscience. So the actual French law, then there were, I mean, it's all sorts of side issues about, I think, very bad treatment of religious orders, et cetera, and so on, which get mixed up here. But the actual French legislation is much more compatible with the views I'm putting forward now than people very often think. And that a certain kind of hard-line laicist Republican in France thinks. I mean, they have a view that's rather different. So the reality of the legislation, the reality of French practice is one thing. The kind of myth around hard laïcité, which I must say is very powerful in Quebec, is another thing. Okay, so why is there this resistance? I want to propose some even more provocative, maybe these aren't provocative remarks. I'll get you mad in the second part of my talk when I try to tell you why I think it's hard to get this point across. And I think it's hard because there are, I want to say, two linked mistakes which people very easily make. And they're not just sort of slips of the mind, they have very deep motivational roots, which are all, some of them very, very valid and very important, which I want to dig down to. The two mistakes are that people think that they can define secularism or laïcité, depending on what language they're in, by some institutional arrangement. So you say, what is it? What is it? Well, separation of church and state, or wall of separation, or it's neutrality of the public sphere, religion must be in the private sphere. These formulae come forward around the notions of neutrality and the notion of separation of church and state. They think that these formulae, as they've been handed down, are the basic formulae that you have to look to in order to tell yourself, well, is this proposal, do we let the girls wear the hijab in the public schools or not? Well, let's look at our basic formula. I want to argue that that's a mistake. And it's obvious why I think it's a mistake, but I'll just go into it in a minute. But the second mistake that goes along with that mistake is that precisely you can, I suppose it's the same mistake from another angle, you can settle arguments by just focusing on the great canonical formula, right? Separation of church and state. So does this proposal meet that or not? Yes, no, that's it. And what this covers over, which immediately comes to light if you adopt the other view that I'm talking about, is that there are a plurality of goals involved in secularism as I want to define it. And therefore, you can get, and you do get, conflicts. That is, the considerations of ensuring free exercise of religion or free exercise of one's conscience can run into, make problems for, be in difficult tension with the requirements of neutrality. I mean, just look at the hijab discussion in Europe. You see, in the French case, it was finally ruled out in public schools. In the German case, the school children can wear it in public, but it's not all of Germany, but certain Länder. School children can wear it, but not teachers, right? And then in British and other cases, there isn't a restriction, there isn't a general restriction, though different schools have different policies, right? But so you get these different rulings on this issue. Well, let's look at the German case. I think it's really quite telling here. Where the Germans said, well, we don't want to be like the French and lean on the kids. But we can't allow the teachers to wear hijab because it's a religious sign, and these people are authority figures in their classes, right, in the school, and authority should be unmarked, is maybe one of the ways of putting this basic principle. Right? So, see the requirements here of why should authority be unmarked? Because the public schools are public schools, they're for everybody, they shouldn't be marked one way or the other, right? So, the requirement, number two requirement, if you like, of neutrality is running into number one requirement of freedom of expression. Because what you're saying to these people, if they really have a very strong sense of conscience, this métier, being a teacher, is not for you. Right? You have to go and do something else. You can't do this. And this is a tension between these two. And if you look at the micro-arguments that occur here, what is really going on is a kind of weighing of these two considerations, which end up being differently weighed. In the French case, it got very much muddied by a lot of, I think, very extraneous stuff that got in there about supposedly these girls are making a point, they're making a speech act of defiance to the French Republic, and that's why the signes ostentatoires, I mean, very ostentatious signs were ruled out and so on. But you see that there are in a way, that's another way of saying what I'm trying to say, that there's a recognition that there's some kind of demand for freedom here, and you have to overrule it by something else like that. Either that what's really going on is not a case of freedom, but a case of provocation, or that, yeah, it's okay for the kids, but not for the teachers. They're weighing two principles. That's what we're always doing in politics. And I argue that that's what we rationally ought to be doing in our secularist regimes. Look at the basic goals, allow for there being real dilemmas, and then argue what the best trade-off solution is for the dilemma whenever it arises. So if you like a revisionist polysemy, I'm proposing another definition of the term. But this leads to what I could call contingent polysemy. That is, if you do think of it in this way, these two demands, what do they mean in this context? How can we trade them off best in this, or combine them best in this context? We get another kind of polysemy. The context is so different, considerations are so different, that the answers are going to start being different from place to place. Right? In the light of all this, looking at secularism as a single principle, institutionally defined, particularly, I mean, that's bad even if you look at it in terms of your own society, notre laïcité, so, but it's even worse if you look at it as something written there in the sky. I mean, there is a proper principle somewhere of secularism. Let's pull it down and apply it. All that just allows you to skirt around and not consider and not work out what the dilemmas are, how to balance them. Your mind gets, in a certain sense, frozen. I mean, we thought of using this term in the report, and we understandably perhaps withdrew. But I mean, there's a kind of fetishization, you might say, fetishization of certain historical formulae. And I mean, I regret, I feel that sometimes in American discussion when people say, wall of separation. I mean, okay, the mind stops. But, you know, you want to say, well, just a minute. I mean, what is the cost in terms of freedom? What is the cost in terms of neutrality? Let's sit down and think about it. Or in the French case, la laïcité. Enfreint la laïcité. And again, you get, and perhaps I'm being unfair, but you get the same kind of, the eyes glaze and the mind freezes, and one can't go on with the discussion. And I think that this is this double mistake, see, thinking that the formula is the thing, and that which has the result that it obviates you're looking at the dilemmas, is part of what keeps us in this older mold of defining secularism as some kind of limitation on religion. And this is something which is very, very powerful, but I don't think, maybe I've been disrespectful about this in my remarks, I don't think it's just a mistake. I think it comes from very deep, and I want to, in the lifeblood of democratic societies. And I want to talk about that for a minute in order to try to bring that out. I think we can say that a contemporary democratic society that we now know it requires some very powerful common reference points that everybody's united on in order to function, right? And we see these arising, of course, in our history, partly as, in terms of political morality, if you like, I mean, things like democracy, human rights, equality. But in fact, what people have got to have an allegiance to is not just these principles in general. They have to have an allegiance to a particular historical project, which is ours, of putting these principles into effect. And that's why what you have is almost always in the actual political identity, as I want to call it, of democratic societies, a dimension where we're dealing with general principles, and a dimension where we're dealing with certain historically particular things. I mean, people look to the American Revolution, to, you know, I listened to this magnificent inaugural of your new president with just tremendous pleasure. Of course, the rest of the world is, you know, just delighted that somebody with a real mind is leading. And he mentioned Washington and Valley Forge and so on. Right, this is a very, very, doesn't resonate with us. I mean, you know, my ancestors were on the other side. Never mind, they were loyalists. But we see how it resonates here, and it's very, very powerful part of an identity, right? So states, democratic states need this. You couldn't just say, well, you know, it doesn't matter what you hold here. Without that kind of cohesion, you don't get a whole lot of things. You don't even get a discussion where people trust their interlocutors, because they can easily come to believe the interlocutors aren't talking about the same thing, aren't talking about the same interests, aren't concerned about the same things. You, above all, don't get what societies very, very deeply need, I think, the power to help each other. I mean, including, let us say, allow these days redistributive taxation. The world doesn't collapse on our heads when we say that. Without this kind of sense that we are all Americans, we are all Canadians, or we are all Québécois, you don't get that. So my case is that it's not just a whim. It's very important to have these powerful notions of our common values, of our way of doing these, realizing these common values, and so on and so on. So this gives a new light to something like what I'm calling unkindly the fetishization of laïcité. It's very understandable. I mean, it's, you know, look at it from a French point of view. This is our way of expressing the universal here, the freedom and equality. And this comes out of our history, and we had to fight for this. And, you know, it's really what defines us. Okay, so from another point of view, you can and you ought to be deeply understanding and sympathetic about this, and that's what I'd like to do. I mean, you know, on one hand, I don't want to take back a syllable of this word fetishization on one hand. On the other hand, I understand where they're coming from, because even if it has this very powerful role and function and root in the common identity and is very necessary, it can still wreak havoc, particularly when the society is diversifying, so that new religious groups are there, new groups are there, and the exigencies of finding a way of living with them can be blocked by our adherence to what was previously the solution evolved a century ago in 1905. So in a way, okay, how do I put these 2 points together, my sense of fetishization here and my sense of respect? I think that you had to put together in this way that modern contemporary democratic societies have to make a real effort to wrench and separate themselves from certain formulae which have been very important in the past, in order precisely to rescue the very deep values and goals that these formulae originally enshrined. So what we tried to say in our report was really something of the following kind. Forget my third thing in the moment, for the moment. We defined laïcité in terms of two basic goals, freedom of conscience and this kind of equality. And then we said, yeah, there are two other things, separation of church and state, or if you like, mutual autonomy of state and religious, or Al Stepan has this expression, the twin tolerations. I mean, people have got different words for this. So that's one kind of thing. And the other kind of arrangement that people talk about is the neutrality of the public institutions. And our point was, if you take these two goals and two institutional, if you like, modes of realization, you get a kind of quadrangle in which the issues of laïcité or secularism arise. But what should be clear is that the prime motor here, the prime movement here comes from the two principles. It's not that you could ever do without some modality of separation and obviously some modality of state neutrality. It's that you ought to be ready to reshuffle, tailor, shape these institutional modalities in the light of what those two goals really require here and now. Now, that kind of demand is a demand to take some distance from things that are even very, if you like, sacred, if I can use this word, in one's own political life. And one doesn't do that lightly. But I think this demand is justified in the name of the very fundamental values that these arrangements were meant to enshrine, and probably did enshrine at an earlier moment. So we take the basic principle is then, the basic notion is that these two goals are primary, and the actual way of shaping separation and neutrality has to be thought out in terms of the maximization of those two goals. Well, I think that this is probably, I would like to argue, a very good idea, a very good way of thinking in abstract, in general. But I think that it's become urgent to adopt this way of thinking because all of our societies are diversifying at a tremendous pace. And if you like, the original sort of forces that were meeting, the original spiritual or non-spiritual views that were on the scene, the original religions or non-religions which were there, are now joined by many others. I mean, there are many religions that weren't very familiar in the Western world that are now here, but there are also many, if you like, non-religions, modes of non-religiosity and spirituality and so on, which have not come in by immigration very often, but have come because there has been this tremendous diversification of people's opinions, spiritual searching, and so on. So we have a very, very different, if you like, cast of characters in our societies that our secularist regime has to find a way of bringing together in some kind of comity, amity, justice, equality, and so on. And that means that, I think what the important thing that it means is that there's been a shift from the searching for a proper secularist formula in a society where one very powerful religion was threatening, to a situation where we're searching for a solution in a society where there isn't any dominant philosophy, religion, and so on, but where there are a great number of different ones that are very strongly held and have to be given their space. In other words, the issue of diversity, rather than the issue of fighting off domination, has become our primary issue. That's why, I mean, if I can sort of buckle up with connect to the beginning point, when I said that I'm very inspired by Rajiv Bhargava's work, it's not an accident that it's possible for us to look on India as a model, perhaps more germane at certain moments to, okay, I don't know how to put this in a very diplomatic way. All right, well, say that those of us who are living somewhere else than America and France and are looking around for our models, we might be better advised to look to India rather than to France or America. though it would be even better if France and America evolved in this same direction. You see, why? Well, because our situation is really a situation, I mean, Canada, of course, in spades, a situation where it's this kind of diversity, which is the really key fact, and where the conflicts between these diverse groups, where none is going to dominate, are the ones that really cause deep misunderstandings and very often great, very depreciatory opinions by some groups of others, and the very potentially poisoned public debate and so on. It's in that kind of situation that our secularist or laïc regime has to operate, has to function in order to bring us out of this and make it possible for us to live together with the maximum of, I would say, I mean, comity, justice, and equality. So I'm proposing, therefore, this other way of looking at secularism, other way of starting from these two principles, not only because I think it is a better way to get clear on what's going on, but because it's much better adapted, anyway, to speak for my own country, to our situation than the older models we got from the US and the French cases. Well, let me stop here because I'm sure there are lots of questions and objections, and thank you very much for your very, very kind attention.
Why don't we have people line up at the microphones if you want to ask questions. There are microphones on the left and right, and we'll alternate. I'm going to take questions in sets of 2 or 3, okay, so we can have Chuck respond to maybe 2 or 3 questions. Are any people on the left-hand side here? I just want to give everybody an opportunity. Why don't you introduce yourself, okay, and ask the first question. I'll have several questions to the floor, then have Chuck.
One of the major reasons for the decline of religion in Europe is that the Catholic Church and other churches became allied with bad governments, and when they did, support for the churches declined. There were conditions that were attached, and so they compromised. So I'm wondering, Justice Souter would argue that this is an important value. He argues it in the voucher cases. I'm wondering why it's left out in the Canadian context and whether it makes sense to leave it out in the Canadian context.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask Jay to ask a question to give the mic, and then we'll have Dick and the other gentleman ask 2 questions afterwards. Okay, so until they get a mic.
These are going to get grouped.
Yeah, they'll get grouped to groups of 2. Okay.
From the philosophy department here at the New School. I like the revision. I like the 3 principles, that they are freedom, respect, and equality. They are liberté, equality, fraternité. So it's not an accident that they work. They are the fundamental principles of secular society, which makes me think that there's a red herring here, because the question is, what sort of culture can we promote that has those 3 principles as its effective and moving source? So it seemed to me you left them as formal principles and all the work at the level of negotiation. But if you ask the question about what kind of society could have those, it's a society in which they were the moving principles and not, so to speak, the diverse bits that go on, I would say, in private. So it seems to me that there's a question that you are arguing for, despite yourself perhaps, the thought of religion within the limits of democracy alone, where it's democracy that's ruling. So it is a wholly secular frame nonetheless.
Yeah. Okay. I think that the first point is very well. The first point is very well taken. I mean, there is a real danger involved there, and it behoves religious groups to think very seriously about this, about their relation to the state. But it's not something that I consider to be a principle that everybody has to subscribe to in a society, which my two principles, I think, are. I mean, the principles that everybody should subscribe to. Maybe other considerations about how close you get to the state, which from their own theological point of view, religions ought to think seriously about. And I would say that from a theological point of view, getting money from the state is not the only and not the main danger, but I think you ought to be familiar with this in this country. Becoming hyper-patriotic and thinking that your state represents the plan of God is much bigger danger from the standpoint of Judeo-Christian and Muslim religion. So I think that when we're looking at what the principles everybody has to adopt, I think those two, or maybe three, I agree, Jay, I really had liberty, equality, and fraternity in the, but the third one, fraternity, is a little bit of a cheat for the third one. But now, to get to Jay's point, I think that's really very wrong. You said the frame is just the three principles and not the diverse bits. Why do people believe in the frame? Why do I believe in the right to life? I'm going to give you a story about people made in the image of God. Why do you believe in the right to life? You may give me a story, you know, we'll go on and have diverse stories. Without these diverse stories, we don't subscribe to those things. That's the motor that allows us to have a free society, that everybody really subscribes for very deep reasons that touch their fundamental religious or metaphysical beliefs. And, you know, there's got to be, I think was it you or Steve who mentioned that there's got to be a language of the state, which is not anybody's language. You couldn't have a law saying, whereas the Bible says that P, therefore. You couldn't have a law saying, whereas Marx says that religion is the opium of the people. It's not just religion. You can't take any particular person's belief system or particular group's belief system and enshrine it in legislation or judicial decisions. But let's not fool ourselves. What makes it possible to have that kind of society is that there are these diverse opinions which converge on that. And you only have a democratic society because you get that kind of convergence. So there isn't, you see, there are, I think this is the great mistake of early Rawls, and even late Rawls didn't quite get out of it. There isn't a canonical justification of democracy, which is somehow free from religion. There are only Kantian justifications, you know, utilitarian justifications, Christian justifications, Muslim, you know, there isn't a canonical justification. And if we started to try to find one, we'd violate principle two. So I think it's really very, very big misconception to separate the agreed principles from what motivates people to espouse them.
You have the first question from Stephen?
Yes, I thought I answered that. What else? What?
Oh, no, I just did this, okay. I don't know, they didn't get, okay, you want to walk to the, could both of you walk to the other side? Because I guess there's no mic here. Okay, if you can speak loudly, and then, and introduce yourself quickly.
Yeah. Dick Bernstein from the New School. Okay.
The microphone comes from Muhammad.
Chuck, I mean, as always, what you have to say is reasonable, humane, judicious, and really, if we had such a society, it would be wonderful. But it seems to me that what also happens here is the way in which you, to me, slur over the really hard cases. I mean, there are people. I mean, you say that they're not just formal. It can be concrete. But I can give you a hypothetical, but it's not hypothetical. If my deepest religious convictions are that abortion is murder, then there is no question for me. I'm not violating somebody's freedom of conscience. If they have a different opinion, I'm not violating a kind of respect. I can respect them, but they're wrong, and murder is wrong. And if there are enough people like me, I mean, granted, this is a parochial American case, and I can get control of the state, then there is no reason why this should not be outlawed completely. Now, how does your solution, you know, your principles really speak to this case? I mean, my argument would be, if I were adopting this position, you are already doing what you object to in liberal societies. You're demanding of me that I should respect somebody who I believe is thoroughly immoral. So how do you deal, I mean, that's one case, but we could think of other hard, how do you deal with the hard cases where people are absolutely convinced that their view is not just one which is a different one among many's, but is really the moral or the right political view, and the other people, so I'm not violating freedom of conscience, I'm not violating respect, but I'm treating you as a murderer.
Charles Courtney from Drew University. At another level, how does the understanding of secular that you proposed tonight relate to your initial distinction between the external and internal dyad? Does it lead possibly to reinstituting an internal dyad, or does this new understanding perhaps finesse that whole issue?
Yeah, okay. So, did I take these two? Yeah. So, Dick, I mean, I think that, let me just give you another case. Robespierre, right? He thought that certain kind of virtue was absolutely essential to democracy, and if you didn't have that virtue, boy, we could purge you, cut your head off. Okay, it's not a religious problem specifically. It's a problem of people who have views about other people and about the potential, permissible variation, which make it impossible to have a democratic society. You say, what's the solution to that? I mean, is there a solution in philosophy to that? You know, you don't have a democratic society if you have enough people who think like Robespierre or like your extreme opponent of abortion. You don't. And this is the real hard problem, is the political problem of convincing enough people that democracy is important enough and that they have to respect other people's views and so on. But this is not something which philosophy can solve, right? So what you're putting to me is a case which nobody can solve in the philosophical level, right? We have to convince people not to follow Robespierre. We have to convince people not to follow the hypothetical person you're talking about. And it's not specifically a religious problem. It's a problem of fanaticism in the views that different people have. Yeah. I mean, in the last couple of centuries, there have been more, you know, the atheist fanatics have scored a higher number of deaths, body counts, than the others. But that's just the last couple of centuries before, you know, the others were winning. Now, no, we can't reinstate because I think we now have a view of the world in which we see the imminent frame as self-contained. So each one of us has to think, well, is it really all there is? We think of something, but we're never going to have total agreement on this issue. We have to, the reinstallation of total agreement on that, which would be part of the very underlying framework of society. You see, and that's not going to happen.
Okay, Laura Miller, I'm a doctoral student at the New School in the Political Science Department. First of all, you know, the move at the Supreme Court to go from the kind of dichotomous or dyadic framing that you first mentioned to elaborating freedom of religion into freedom of conscience. When I look at Supreme Court cases, you can see in the post-World War II period these attempts being made. And the first dilemma that I wanted to point out, if you look at, for example, some of the CO cases, conscientious objector cases, is that when you move away from this kind of definitional dichotomous formula, is that then it opens up the possibility of licensing all sorts of forms of dissent that clearly the court is reluctant to go there. So, for example, you know, in the military code, it rules out claims that would be based on the wording of something like philosophical, sociological, political, and merely personal moral claims. So you can see the court struggling with, on the one hand, this gesture of inclusiveness, and the other hand, wanting to pull it back and say, well, but the kinds of claims we license really do make recourse to belief in a supreme being that reins it in. So first is the dilemma of what then would be the limits for freedom of ethical conscience. But the second thing, at least in my understanding or framing of these things, is that yes, you have the dichotomous model, you have the ethical conscience model, but then you get what I kind of am characterizing as an identity politics turn. And the identity politics turn, to me, is partly this critique of liberalism as really biased and there is no neutrality, and the ethical conscience move is looked upon in that way, but it's also relational in terms of what goes on in the U.S. In the post-60s era with racial claims and then sexual orientation and gender. And so I think, so in terms of your talking about what's the dilemma, what's the resistance, see, I think the question, and at least in America, is the genie's out of the bottle. And so for religious claimants now, the discourse is looking and saying, well, why can't I have if you can have your gay and lesbian after-school program, why can't I have my Bible study program? And that it seems to me that even on a more theoretical level, like your book, Secular Age, when you talk about a sense of fullness, if a religious identity is really predicated on this something that's very unique, that's not like other identities, that you can't analogize religion with race or with sexual orientation, then to go into the ethical conscience move is reacted against as somehow diminishing religion.
Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Just introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Ed Baker, Penn Law School. I think that when you purge the person in Dick's example, I mean your reputation, that you were pretty clearly violating the first principle of maximizing freedom. But my question goes to whether or not he was really challenging you not as to that issue, but to the notion of your interpretation of equality or interpretation of your second principle. If one thought that politics ought to be a realm in which people did a couple of things. One is that they know that they might win, but they might lose. But on the other hand, that you had to respect the other person, either the loser or the winner. And so I'm wondering whether or not there's a need to play with your interpretation of equality to get to the notion of neutrality, or whether there's other conceptions of equality that wouldn't require that notion of neutrality.
Yeah. Good. Well, the first question is a very, very good one. I mean, we are riding a tiger, I agree, in our society. The thing is that this is the same, I mean, very much the same kind of tiger, whether you stick to a freedom of religion definition or you move to a freedom of conscience. I mean, what exactly is a religion? The peyote case and so on. These are very hard things to judge. And what actually is real issue of conscience as against an issue of, an issue where the moral integrity of the person is involved, as against simply a preference, we can argue about that indefinitely. So there's a real problem here, I agree, in our society, a real problem of defining things, which wasn't the case in the good old days or the bad old days, like the First World War, where people went up to, for conscientious objection, and it was a clear list of the Quakers okay, and so-and-so is okay, and so on. But the various Bloomsbury people were left out of that. In those days, when there was a kind of already existing list of potential claimants to these exceptions, it was much, much simpler. But granted that we can't have that, is there any other solution except something like a notion of freedom of conscience? I mean, is there any other definition that would somehow make it easier to judge, to draw the line? And I don't really think so. But I really see the force of what you're saying, that there is a deep, deep problem about this. The last question reminded me that the first questioner made a very important point that I meant to pick up on, which is the language. See, I don't know if I agree with the first questioner about the language of the state. I don't think that the political discussion in the polity or even in legislature needs to be in some neutral language. I think that legislation has to be in such a language. In other words, you couldn't, but this is not something that specifically excludes religious references. As I said earlier, it excludes various kinds of philosophical references. Why? Well, because if you put it in the actual wording of the legislation or you put it in a Supreme Court decision as part of the reasoning for it, you are canonizing that reasoning in the name of the state. Now, is anybody belittled because something measure they fought for very strongly because they thought it was something demanded by the gospel and now happens if it just measure, let's say, is a greater measure of tax equality or and so on? Well, if it happens under the language of the taxes will be proportional to X or Y. Is that a betrayal of their language? You know. Anyway, if you apply this universally, you say, well, it's got to mention the gospel, Marx, the Fabian society. You know, where do we stop? I think that there's not here a lack of respect. There simply is the observance in the wording of the legislation of a certain prudence. What I think is absolutely tyrannical and unacceptable is what Rawls first said, that the public debate has to be in a purged language. That's, I think, unacceptable. You should be allowed to make the public debate, even as an MP, even as a congressman, in the language you most feel identified with. Now, you might lose support if you put it in more sectarian terms, so yeah, that's true, but I mean, that's up to you as the legislator or the citizen to decide. I think it's quite tyrannical to say, in order to participate in this debate, you have to sanitize your language. I think that really is something that is unacceptable. But not that the wording of the legislation should be in terms that don't refer to anybody's profound reasons.
Introduce yourself and then we'll put the mic over here.
I'm Marca Valenta. I'm coming from Amsterdam. And the question I have is, you were saying that one of the reasons we're having a problem today is because there's been an explosion of pluralism. But when you look around Europe, when you look around America, Canada, right, there's always been tremendous pluralism. And the pluralism, so what it seems like to me today, that the problem isn't so much that you have more pluralism, or even that you have a different sort of pluralism, because Europe and America and so forth has tremendous experience with these other groups in the colonies. So it's not new per se, and it's not greater per se, but the big problem is that the kinds of solutions we had, which were hierarchy and segregation, aren't solutions that we support ideologically anymore. And the idea is that now we're equal. But when you're equal, then who gets to have a say? And I know, I mean, you go into that in your report and your recommendations. But what I see, in one of the things you were talking about today is, well, one way is that you have a shared reference point. You have shared national canon or reference or histories. But the problem is that how that gets created is through dogmatic, disciplinary, certain sorts of forced mechanisms of education that we also don't quite support. So my question is, if nationalism becomes voluntary and everybody's equal, can you come up with those kinds of general solutions? Or doesn't it have to be fractured to the level of the municipal or to the more specific case by case? And the problem is simply searching at the national level evil, that national level no longer works, but we need to be looking at different levels.
Mm-hmm. Well,
pass the mic.
Oh, sorry, yes. So we have two again, right? Okay, I'll have to remember this one. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, hi. Ali Musa, undergraduate at Fordham University Lincoln Center. I'm inclined to agree with your opposition to a dogmatic secularism, and I think it's very useful the criteria you posited of fetishizing, and by fetishizing I take it you mean something crystallized, no longer up for debate or discussion, sort of a dead letter which sort of comes down to then oppress the very people that uttered the utterance. My question is whether or not religion would be the very embodiment of that because of its reliance on ritual, ceremony, etc. I mean, clearly if fetishism is the criterion that you're putting forward, at the formal level. I mean, clearly you don't endorse theocracy then. But on the level of content, I imagine then would that criteria also still apply? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so should I take these two? Yeah. Now, just a minute. I suddenly had a blank. What this question was about, very important question about...
whether or not it's at the national level.
Oh, yes, sorry, yeah. Level. No, I think we're both right about what brought about the diversity. I mean, for instance, in a country like Canada, there were very few Muslims, almost no Buddhists, no Hindus 50 years ago, and now there are lots. So it's partly the addition of new people. But it's partly exactly the same people demanding to be heard. I mean, think of the feminist movement, you know, that changed very, very much the political situation in all our countries. These are people who have always been there, but they didn't demand to be heard. So this issue of equality and equality and difference is the key thing. I agree with you. I don't despair of working out a new sense of what our society is all about, which can find its place for all these very diverse groups. And that's what, I mean, multiculturalism in its various forms, or interculturalism we call it in Quebec, that's what it's trying to do. Trying to find a way of redefining what it is that unites us, what our polity is all about, in such a way that there's a place for all these different voices. And there is, you know, these things can either be very difficult because you're already on a path of alienation, or they can be relatively easy if you get on a path where people are beginning to see the advantages of being able to agree and live together like that, and are therefore motivated to go further. And so I don't think there's any impossibility in principle here, though I think there are some very difficult situations that certain societies are in, which I don't quite know how they get out of. Yeah, and the fetishization thing, I don't think I quite understood. I mean, what I mean by fetishization is that one is applying a concept as though it were already the answer to a question, where really the issue of whether it is the answer or not needs to be worked on at a deeper level, where you're looking at the basic goals, how they can be combined, and so on. And when people refuse to go down and look at the basic reasons, the deeper reasons, then they're, I mean, fetishization is a term. They're stuck at this level. They can't free themselves from this level. That's what I mean by fetishization.
Okay, you, and then over there, and I think we'll see if there's any time left after that.
Okay. So, my name is Dominic Wetzel. I'm at CUNY. I just want to follow up with the person who, on this side of the aisle here, who was talking about the example of the right to lifer,
yeah. Right?
And I think that this scenario kind of points out maybe some differences between the Canadian and the U.S. context. And my question is, you know, I mean, you answered kind of saying that you know, this isn't a religious problem; it's a problem with this person, yeah, right? Yeah. But in the U.S., it's hard for me to buy that or swallow that, because there are. I mean, I think that if you ask that person that, if you responded to that person, you say, "Oh, this is just, you know, your personal problem," they would say, "No, my religion motivates me. This is a religious belief, right?" Course, yeah. And there are, you know, there are politicized religious movements that, you know, that advocate that, you know, with, you know, theocratic tendencies in the U.S. So this, in that sense, you know, democracy is a lower value than their religious beliefs. So, and I think that's, you know, a recurring problem in the U.S. I mean, my own parents, who are very traditionalist Catholics, you know, I mean, I probed and I finally realized, wow, there's something missing here. There's the whole the democracy part of, like, that the American, you know, worship of democracy kind of went out the window. I mean, in an older version, I think Catholics were concerned about, you know, being viewed as papists, and so there was a little more, you know, separation of church and state, you know. But I think that there's been a reorganization, and you have a rise of the evangelical right that has sought to recruit discontented traditionalist Catholics who, you know, were given the disarray with Catholicism in the Vatican and whatnot. Something like First Things is a good example, where they're trying to bring these groups together, and so my point being, you know, I think that there is a sizable presence of people where in the U.S. where democracy is a lower value than certain deeply held religious beliefs, and then so how would you deal with that problem?
No, I mean, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Let's try to get these three questions and then together, and then we'll have to conclude.
I'll make a note so I don't have a long memoir. Right.
And really short questions now because we're really running out of time. Okay. So he can answer them. Okay.
Sure. No, so I understand your point and fully agree that I think the fundamental problem is managing diversity. But it seems to me limiting the question to religion is one of the ways that modern states have managed that diversity. So if you want to enrich your conception, our conception, of what these different deeply held convictions are to include non-religious cases, I would ask if we were to grant that secularism can be seen as an ideology, comprehensive conceptions of liberalism can be seen as an ideology, then in your public space, how can you keep your language neutral? How can you have a constitution that is devoid of any of these comprehensive conceptions? Alternatively, as a religious person in the public sphere, actually, let me just limit it at that.
Okay. Introduce yourself, I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. My name's Abdurrahman. I'm here from Boston University. I'm a graduate student in philosophy.
And the last person?
Sam Bagg from undergraduate at Yale. So I agree that democracy definitely needs common reference points. And it seems like in America, one of those common reference points is civil religion, which is based around God. And I'm wondering where you think that leaves atheists and whether that's okay, or if that needs to be negotiated somewhere.
Yeah. Okay, so the last three questions. Well, I mean, the last speaker just said that there are certain people in the United States who put their religious views above democracy. That may be true. I think of some people certainly it's true. How many of them do that, I don't know. I don't contest that. When I said it wasn't specifically a religious problem, I thought the argument was. I was saying, displace the center of attention from religion to diversity. Then you will find that some of the diverse players don't want to play that game. They don't want to accept the legitimacy of the other groups, and they therefore don't want to let the democratic process, as it were, proceed. All I was saying was, look beyond your shores for just a minute. You know, in the rest of the world and history, there have been other people, non-religious reasons, that have done the same thing. So it's not something which inheres only in religion. You see, that's all I was trying to say. And the second thing I was trying to say was, there isn't a philosophical answer to this question. I mean, if there is a deep reluctance on the part of people, certain enough people, to operate in this kind of regime, then we're in trouble. And there isn't a philosophical answer to that. There's only a live political answer to that, and there are different ones. I just disagree with the second question here, but I didn't, the microphone was making strange resonances, so I didn't get it all. But it seems to me that we can and do keep, he's using the Rawlsian language, I think, the comprehensive conceptions of the good. Yeah, that's Rawlsese for what I've been calling basic reasons and so on. Right, okay, we agree on that. I think we do keep them out of the language of legislation. So we don't say God wants this or Marx thinks this, you know, we just say these will be the tax laws and so on. And I think we manage that rather well. Now, there are difficulties about certain symbolism. You know, one nation under God, big problems about that, and I don't want to legislate on that. I mean, give my views on your problem here because I have enough trouble giving views on our problems, and it obsessed me to a great degree. But the actual principle of legislation not being in, as it were, charged language is something that most democratic societies relatively well succeed in, seems to me. Right? Now the third and last question. I'm sorry, I'm getting very addled.
The atheism.
Oh yeah, where do atheists go in America? I mean that if you find that no, I mean I think that is a legitimate complaint can be made by people that if the central symbolism excludes them. Yeah, I think that is something that can legitimately be complained about. And unless the example is totally trivial, it's something worth looking into. That's the whole point of having an unmarked state, a state that isn't the state of the believers, the state of the unbelievers, the state of the this or the that. that, I think, is an essential part of equal respect for all views. I entirely agree with you.
Well, I want to thank Chuck. I mean, this is great. You earned your dinner. Everybody, there's a full conference schedule. We continue. We have more gender balance sessions coming.